Welcome to another lecture in the 6-Step Relational Database Design e-learning series. In this lecture, we will explore Step 1 of the 6-step relational database design process, focusing on its first sub-step, discovering the entities. We will begin by defining what entities are and why they are important in database design. Then, we will discuss how to identify entities from a given problem domain. Finally, we will examine a case study and walk through the steps required to discover entities from a problem statement. What is an entity? An entity is a tangible object of interest that exists in the user's domain. These objects of interest are singular in nature, meaning that they each represent one object of interest or is a collective representing one object of interest and does not include a combination of more than one object of interest. Each object of interest or entity should have a clear and independent identity within the problem domain and should not be defined by its relationship to other entities. This distinction is important for maintaining clarity in the database structure and ensuring that relationships are modeled separately and explicitly. It ensures that each entity stands on its own conceptually, making it easier to model relationships and maintain a normalized, well-structured database design. In the problem domain, nouns or collective nouns typically denote such objects of interest or entities. Identifying entities. To identify entities effectively, a clear and concise problem statement is essential. Crafting clear and concise problem statements is not always straightforward, as it often involves in-depth discussions with the client and careful analysis of the problem and the information relevant to the problem domain. It is a critical part of the database development process, and every effort should be made to ensure the statement is both precise and comprehensive without omitting any essential details. Discovering entities. There are a few steps that we need to follow in order to discover the entities. First, you must identify and list all of the main collective nouns and nouns in the problem statement that represent objects of interest within the problem domain. They must capture all of the data that needs to be captured from this domain, except those necessary for role-based access and auditing. Those objects will be recorded in the next step. There should be no entity name sharing. That is, each object of interest or entity should have a clear and independent identity within the problem domain and should not be defined by its relationship to other entities. This ensures that each object of interest or entity stands on its own conceptually, making it easier to model relationships explicitly and maintain a normalized, well-structured database design. List the objects necessary for role-based access and basic auditing as required by the statement of the problem. Depending on the specific requirements, this list may vary since some objects may be optional or integrated into other entities. However, there is generally a standard set of core objects commonly required in applications that implement role-based access and auditing. Each object of interest listed through this process becomes an entity that forms part of the overall database design. Case study. The following case study will be used to demonstrate the steps previously outlined to discover the entities from a given problem domain. A corporate office intends to implement a digital front desk solution to assist receptionists in managing key administrative functions for senior management staff, such as executives and department heads. In addition to the stated capabilities of the application, it must support role-based access control, ensuring that users, such as receptionists, assistants, and senior staff, can only access features appropriate to their roles. User login activity must also be logged, and the application should include basic auditing features, such as tracking who created or modified records and when. A useful technique for identifying the objects of interest in a problem statement is to highlight them, either by using a highlighter or by making them bold. Here, we have highlighted them in yellow. This visual cue helps isolate key terms, which are the nouns and collective nouns, and makes it easier to focus on them. Once highlighted, you can then extract and review this list to ensure each highlighted item corresponds to a distinct, tangible object of interest that will most likely become an entity in your database design. This method filters out extraneous information and keeps the focus on essential user data. Here is a list of the entities that were discovered for this case study. They are listed into two categories, the application entities and the CRUD, create, read, update, and delete entities. The application entities are the entities that are necessary for the core features of the application that do not include role-based access and auditing, whereas the CRUD entities are those necessary for role-based access and basic auditing as required by the statement of the problem. Roles can be either a property or characteristic of users or a separate object of interest. It is listed here as a separate object of interest for correctness and is explained in detail in future lectures. Here is a summary of what we covered in this lecture. An entity is a tangible object of interest that exists in the user's domain. It is singular in nature, has a clear and independent identity within the problem domain, and is not defined by its relationship to other entities. To identify entities effectively, a clear and concise problem statement is essential, along with in-depth discussions with the client and careful analysis of the problem and the information relevant to the problem domain. To discover entities, you must identify and list all the main collective nouns and nouns in the problem statement that represent objects of interest. Entities necessary for role-based access and auditing are also recorded. There should be no entity name sharing. That is, each entity should have a clear and independent identity within the problem domain and should not be defined by its relationship to other entities. Each object of interest listed through the process outlined in this lecture becomes an entity that forms part of the overall database design. You can learn more about the 6-step relational database design process by visiting my website, fidelcaptain.com. by purchasing a copy of the book on Amazon.com, or by downloading the ebook on Kindle.